Hello, my name's Chrissy. Welcome to my kitchen. I've had a few people ask me lately about sourdough bread and ask for a recipe or how I do it. And I'm not really going to give exactly a recipe because I think there are hundreds of recipes out there available. But I'm just going to show what I do and a couple of little pointers that have really helped me. I've been baking yeast breads for years, but really with sourdough bread only had good success and consistent success for a couple of years. Before that, every time I tried, I would have mixed results. Sometimes I would get a loaf that was halfway decent, and sometimes it would just be rock hard. It wouldn't rise, and I could never figure out exactly what it was I was doing wrong. The breakthrough came for me when I did a course on the School of Traditional Skills. It was a sourdough baking course with Maureen Diaz, and she just broke down everything to such simple steps and gave me an understanding that really made all the difference. And I think the key concept that was different was viewing sourdough as an art more than a science, which is something I could grasp, something that was attainable, something that didn't have to be exactly measured or exactly timed, but was more, how does it look? How does it feel? What's happening with your dough, what's happening with the temperature, and her way of explaining it just made all the difference. But the other great thing she did in the course was teach you what to do in those situations, and I just think that was very empowering, how to fix something, maybe turn it into a different type of loaf if the original thing I planned wasn't working out. And I've got an example of that happened just this week. So it was just, hopefully this will be a few ideas that might help you on your sourdough journey. So first thing I do is make sure I've got an active bubbly starter, which I fed this earlier today, and you can see it's nice, and hopefully you can see nice and bubbly. So I'm going to add 1 cup of the starter to the bowl, just a regular mixing bowl, 1 cup of flour, and then 1 cup of water. And I just try and use, this is well water, or if you want to you can use purified water, but just not chlorinated water if you can. I'm just mixing those 3 ingredients, the cup of starter, a cup of flour, baker's flour, and a cup of pure water, to get all the lumps out and make it well incorporated. So you can see I've just mixed it until it's all mixed in, and then that just sits there for about anywhere between 20 minutes and 4 hours really, which that's again the beauty of the way I was taught that has made a big difference, is it doesn't have to be exact. So if I get busy teaching a child with a math lesson or doing laundry or doing any number of the myriad of other things that happen in my day, it's okay. I can come back in 15 minutes and get onto it straight away, or I can leave it for a bit and then take it on to the next stage of the bread. So this step where I'm mixing the flour, the water and the starter is called autolyzing, is when you're autolyzing the beginning of the dough, but really that's just a fancy term that you don't even really need to know. And again, I think a lot of times sourdough is overcomplicated. There are lots of terms that are not, that we're not familiar with, that are bandied around. And what I loved about Maureen Diaz's class is that she just simplified. Honestly, it just felt like, a grandmother figure in the kitchen with me, breaking it down and just common sense and very, very, just normal and practical, and as a busy mum, I don't have time for fancy and complicated. So I just really appreciated how attainable she made it and how simple it really turned out to be. So it's been, I think, about an hour and a half, and I fed kids and folded laundry, and I've come back. A cup of flour, this is a 1/2 cup measure, another cup of water, stir that in. You know, a lot of the previous recipes and things I had tried over the years were so complicated with measuring flour amounts, you know, by grams, and timing things to the minute, and having to do 50 million stretch and folds. And I just never could get it to, I don't know, maybe I'm just not as an exact a person as that, and for me, viewing something as an art instead of a science just made it so much more achievable. So I'm going to add a tablespoon of salt, which both brings out the flavor and makes it taste really good, but it also just stabilizes the yeast so it doesn't over proliferate more than we want it to. And I'm just going to add a 1/2 cupful at a time of flour until I get a stiff dough, and then I'm going to turn it out and give it a knead on the bench. Now at this point I will often throw in, you can mix the flours up a bit. This is some bulk wholemeal flour, or you can hear it's called whole wheat flour. I'm just going to put a cup of that in. I don't like it as much when I do it 100% whole wheat. It just makes for a very heavy loaf. Although having said that, I do love a good rye loaf. But if I mix the flours a bit, and really you can play with that as much or as little as you choose, whatever pleases you. As you can see, this is starting to become a lot thicker. I am really not very talented with this camera, but it's starting to become thicker. So I'll add a little bit more, and then I'm going to turn it out onto this bench top. Bit of flour down here. Just going to turn this out here. You know, the reality is that people have been making sourdough bread for centuries, and they didn't have fancy scales or kitchen equipment. It really doesn't need that. Now you can do that, and if that is what you love, then hey, go for it. But for me, it was so helpful just to simplify the whole process down and realize that there's a few key things I can look for. So right now this hasn't all fully come together. I'm just gonna knead it on the bench top until it does fully come together into a nice dough, and pull it off my fingers. So you can see it's starting to kind of come together more. And the other thing I discovered is that you don't have to knead it for half an hour. Just keep adding a little bit more flour to my bench workspace so that it doesn't stick. Really just takes a few minutes. I just want to show you this. So you can see over here there's a roughness to it where the gluten hasn't worked as much just yet. So although it's kind of leaving an indent there, it's not bouncing as much back as much as I would like it to. It's starting to smooth on this side, but it just needs a little bit more. So you want it to be smooth. Now it's not going to be super smooth because I have used wholemeal flour as well as white. So if it was 100% white flour, it would be smoother again, but still you want that slightly smooth appearance in the dough. Okay, so I have kneaded it a bit more, and it's still not super smooth because, like I said, I've used wholemeal flour, but it's bouncing back and it has smoothed out to a nice soft dough. You don't have to knead it for a huge amount of time. So that is ready now, and I will pop it in my little bowl, like so. Just got all the flour off my hands on my camera. So that will sit there now. I won't even look back at it for until tomorrow morning, really. I'll cover it, except for I will put it in the fridge tonight. So just before I go to bed, I'll stick it in the fridge. Really, that first initial autolyzing, the initial mix of the flour, starter and water took me less than 5 minutes. Then I went away and did other things, came back, and this step here has taken maybe 10 minutes from start to finish. And then I'm just going to walk off and leave it, and it's going to sit on the bench. It's going to ferment. It's going to start to break down the gluten in the grain and the flour and form bubbles as it rises. It will rise up, so it's about quite low in the bowl there. And even by this evening when I go to bed, it'll have risen a lot, and then tomorrow morning. Now, if you live in a really cold climate, you might want to have it out on the bench all night. Here in Texas, I'm not going to do that. Back home in Queensland, I did not do that. Just depends on that's where you just need to look and feel what's the weather doing. Now, if I was making this a couple of weeks ago when it was freezing, I did leave it out on the bench all night. So it just depends what your weather's doing, and you kind of assess it as you go. Good morning, it is the next day. I had covered this in the fridge last night, so I just popped it out of the fridge a little while ago to let it start to get to room temperature, I guess. So now I'm going to pop it out on the bench, fold it a few times, and get it ready for the final rise. So I'm just going to pop it out, kind of peel it back out of there, and I'm going to stretch and fold it over a few times. Now, this wasn't part of the original recipe that I was using. In the initial recipe, you take it out the next day and give it a light knead, just a couple of little kneads, shape it, and put it in for the final rise. I just found that if I just did this a couple of times, depending on how my dough was looking, so my dough's fairly well formed, it's not over fermented. So if it's over fermented, it'll be it'll go kind of soft and more liquidy, I guess, as the yeast, the natural yeasts have broken down the gluten in the grain. But this one is really what I'm kind of looking for. So I'm just going to fold it a few times. I just found, and really I just experimented, I found that sourdough is a lot more forgiving and a lot easier than I first expected. And you can do this, you can sort of just tweak a recipe. So I'm just going to now shape that a little, tuck it under. You can see it's nice and smooth and rounded and ready to. Now you can just pop that onto a piece of parchment paper or baking paper to do a final rise. I do have Banneton baskets. I did not have these for a long time. And I just used to, so I'm just going to flour that lightly. I just used to pop them on a chopping board on a piece of parchment paper for that final rise, and that worked totally fine as well. This just gives it a bit more of a specific shape. So I'm going to pop that in there and leave it for for about another 45 minutes to an hour, even 2 hours. Again, there's no need to be specific or to be stressed about the exact timing of it. It's just going to sit in this covered with a tea towel, and then when I'm ready, I will pop it out onto a piece of parchment paper and pop it into a hot oven. So I think the main encouragement, tip, whatever you want to call it, that I want to offer is that making sourdough bread is a simple bread making process that has been used for hundreds of years in little huts with mud floors. Like, you do not need anything fancy. And the bread, when you provide those basic things, you have the starter, an active bubbly starter, you have the flour, you add a bit of salt, you mix it, you allow it time to ferment and rise. Like, it does all the things. And if you can just have a few things you're looking out for, okay, I need to make sure it's I'm aware of the temperature, make sure my starter is active and bubbly before I begin. There's a lot of wiggle room, and it's really not as complicated as what we often think. Okay, so it's actually been a little bit longer. I got busy doing something else, so that's okay. I'm going to take the bread, it's risen again a little bit, and I'm going to put it on. This is just it helps put it in the oven, and I always try and reuse my parchment paper as many times as possible. So I'm just reusing this piece of parchment. So I'm going to pop that over there, that over there, and just flip it. Oop, maybe over here. Oh, came out easily. Sometimes I have to wiggle it a bit to get it out. That time it came out easily. Now it's slightly cooler today, so it hasn't risen as much as yesterday's bread. That's okay. I am just going to cut in, and honestly, you can just use a sharp knife. You do not have to have one of these blades. I didn't have one of these blades for ages, but I'm going to cut through there. And really, the only purpose of that, sorry, you can hear my kids in the background. I've cut in the top, and really the only purpose of that is to allow the bread to kind of rise up quicker and easier. So you can do fancy stuff, but it's completely not necessary. You could just do a cross down the middle. And now I'm going to pop that in the oven. The oven is at 420, and it really varies a little bit according to your oven. So I had one oven where this was done in 30 minutes. This oven, it's 40 to 45 minutes, and really you're just going to have to play with that to make sure the bread's cooked through. And I'll pop it in the oven, and it's all done. I do use a pizza stone, which again, you don't have to. You can do it on a Dutch oven, in a Dutch oven, I should say. Keep in mind, the goal is not to provide an Instagram-worthy loaf. The goal is to provide a nourishing, yummy, whole food bread for your family that is going to be enjoyed, it's going to be functional, and it's going to be good for every day. So it doesn't have to be fancy. It doesn't have to be something that you would want to put on your Facebook page or your Instagram. It just has to be good home-cooked food. So you don't need to worry about all the fancy designs or the loaf looking perfect every time. Okay, so bread is about ready. We're going to have a little squeeze. You can see it in there. It's risen nicely. Nice crusty. Oh, yeah, here's a learning. This is what happens when you rush. So it's almost cooked through, but not quite in the middle. So I'm actually going to pop it back. Okay, this happens sometimes. Unfortunately, I took it out a tad too early, and the very center of the loaf, it had risen beautifully. The very center wasn't cooked through, so I had to put it back in, which now the downside is that it has made the crust a bit thicker than what is ideal, a bit extra crusty, but I'll show you what it looks like now. So here I've cut it through and it's perfectly fine. Now there's one piece in the middle where you can see the scar from where I cut it and it wasn't done, and I popped it back. So this piece, look, they're still perfectly edible, but that is one thing that really comes down to just knowing your oven. Okay, so this is a good example of when something doesn't quite go according to plan, but it's still quite usable. One of my kiddos didn't realize I had bread in the oven and turned the oven off. So it wasn't at temperature, didn't stay at temperature, and it hasn't risen as it normally would, but it's still quite usable, so I'm not going to throw it out. So you can see it's kind of flattened instead of being nice and high, but when you look inside, it's still quite usable. You've got a bit of extra crust because I had to cook it longer to get it to cook through because it wasn't up at that nice high temperature, but we can always cut the crust off if it's too crunchy, and it's still quite usable. It's simple, it's not complicated, and you can make little mistakes like I did and you can fix it up. The other thing, if you over ferment, I don't know if I said this earlier, if you over ferment the dough in the first rise and it goes real kind of sloppy and is not forming enough of a loaf to be able to shape it well, then I just turn it into a focaccia. I spread it out flat, I put it in a pan, drizzle some olive oil, put a few herbs on top and stick it in the oven, and it still rises enough to be a beautiful focaccia, and it's extra fermented, so it's even healthier. So one of the things that the class I took in the School of Traditional Skills, I feel like really equipped me in that it gave me the basic skills and then some problem solving, what I can do in certain situations, and which then equipped me with the confidence to be able to go ahead and use this ancient baking skill in my everyday kitchen to provide good whole meals for my family without fuss, without bother, and with confidence to know what I was doing. So I hope this has been a help to somebody who maybe has tried and hit some of the brick walls I hit. Hopefully this has given you some ideas to try again and just keep going, because really, honestly, when you get the basics down, it's very forgiving and it's very easy and worth the effort.